related to the project, but please note that Home cannot reimburse the cost of acquisition for a property that is already in your inventory. New construction may include also non-traditional or innovative models such as modular, manufactured housing, 3D printing, or other as approved. So this activity is focused on single-family homes that will be owned and lived in by one family for the period of affordability and projects of 4 homes or less. As I mentioned, this activity is open to nonprofit housing developers with a preference for community housing development organization, or CHODOs. For those of you who don't know, a CHODO developer is a private nonprofit community-based organization that directly employs staff with the capacity to develop affordable housing for the community it serves. To qualify for designation as a CHODO, which is given on a per project basis, the organization must meet certain requirements pertaining to its legal status, board composition, and capacity experience. If you don't know if your organization could qualify as a CHODO, or you think your organization may qualify, you can go to our website, listed in the chat again, to look at the application for CHODO certification for more information. The maximum award for this activity is $1 million for 4 homes, or maximum per unit subsidy of $250,000. So we want to highlight that homebuyer development is not like our other LPA programs, such as owner-occupied rehab or home buyer down payment assistance, nor is it rental development. We just want to distinguish. And the activity is funded through a different funding process. Our funding is open round funding source. So we are making $10 million available through this activity throughout New York State, including for other home PJs, participating jurisdictions. All of our application materials are posted on our website. This is offered through an open funding round with applications being accepted now as of February 28th to October 31st, or until all of the funds have been committed to projects, whichever is sooner. So as I mentioned, eligible applicants include nonprofit organizations or CHODO organizations. The applicant must demonstrate at least 1 year of relevant prior homebuyer or housing development experience and have capacity to complete the project. And there are questions on the application related to that. The award limit is $1 million per project. The max subsidy limit inclusive of developer fee is $250,000 per home for 2 to 4 bedrooms. The limit is different if an applicant is proposing to develop a 1-bedroom home. The max subsidy can not exceed the home max subsidy limits, which is lower for 1 bedroom than for 2+ bedrooms. Eligible uses for the funds can be for soft costs, hard costs, acquisition development costs must be fair and reasonable given the current market and necessary to complete a quality homeownership project to achieve code compliance and offset by funding sources. All costs, including non-home costs, must be reasonable as all costs affect the ultimate need for the home subsidy. So for the development funding, all sources should be sufficient to cover, to cover the cost of development, but not exceed the uses. And non-home sources must be firmly committed for home funds to be committed. Home can be used as a sole source of funding, but developers will likely need other sources in the form of a construction loan or internal capital to make projects feasible. Home development funding is offered at a 0% interest loan forgiven upon the sale to a home eligible buyer. Developer fee is based on project costs only, not including contingencies, and will be paid incrementally at different milestones of production. The Housing Trust Fund Corporation reserves the right to further negotiate the developer fee even after the application is submitted. Project net proceeds, if any, must be returned. So if there's, if you have a sales price that's still, that the home sells for more than the total cost of development, you may end up with some leftover proceeds. But, that'll be determined when you're looking at your costs and sale prices. But any net proceeds will have to be returned as program income. So HOME is a reimbursement program, and as a development project, HOME will be dispersed at certain construction milestones and as costs are incurred. Financing structure depends on the organizational need and capacity. So, while HOME can be used as a sole source, some groups may need to obtain construction loans or lines of credit, or put funds up front to cash flow the project. There's no conversion in this. There's no required construction loan. So the carrying costs or soft costs related to loans or lines of credit will be low, since you'll be getting disbursements along the way. This activity was really designed to help smaller organizations. So, we've tailored this source to accommodate kind of different ways that these groups might be able to finance the projects. As I mentioned, our funding can only be up to $250,000 or the max subsidy limit for the unit proposed, or whichever is less. Development funding subsidy can go up to the maximum home subsidy limit, subject to underwriting and cost reasonableness. So just because we have the limit, you still have to demonstrate that those funds are needed for the project. And home funds can be no more than needed to provide quality, affordable, and financially viable housing throughout the period of affordability. Plans and estimates of costs and sales will be submitted with the application. Sales of completed homes before they're sold are subject to review and approval prior to marketing and selling the unit. Selling the unit is subject to some considerations. So we do ask for marketing plans in the process for home buyer selection, and those have to be reviewed and approved by HCR's Fair and Equitable Housing Office, or FEHO. The sales price of the homes cannot exceed 95% of the median purchase price for the area as published by the home ownership value limits that are listed. You can get those from our website. I linked to those from our website. So the current limits are subject to change annually. Sales price must be established as well based on fair market value. Homes must be sold or under a ratified sales contract within 9 months of completion. So eligible home buyers would be anyone with any household with a combined income of at or below 80% of area median income for the county served. The ultimate home buyer must live in the home as their primary residence for the period of affordability. The period of affordability is likely 15 years, given the amount that will likely be requested. Sale to another home eligible buyer during the period of affordability is allowed, with an assumption of the security instrument in terms of the home agreement. Complete homeownership counseling with a HUD certified housing counselor is required, similar to our down payment assistance activity, and buyers are underwritten to meet 33% front end ratio or 45% back end ratio, and the buyer must be able to demonstrate sustainable ownership for the period of affordability. So some other requirements. All activities must be completed within the 3-year contract term. All construction or rehabilitation must meet state and local code, as well as HUD home regulations, and must follow the HCR homeownership design standards when determining scope of work. The HCR homeownership design standards are on our website, so consult that when you're putting together scopes of work for your application. Environmental review and clearance will be conducted by HCR's environmental unit. The developer must provide all necessary information required to comply with both NEPA and SEQR reviews for each property to be included in the development. And we want to highlight this important part. As a reminder, submission of an application for home funding will constitute consideration for federal funding and start the timeline for the prohibition of choice limiting actions. So without getting into too much detail here, once an application is submitted, all site altering activities must cease until after an environmental clearance is achieved, or you'll risk jeopardizing use of federal funds on the project. So it's super important, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions to clarify that issue. The New York State Home Program must comply with all federal, New York State, and local laws, executive orders, and regulations pertaining to fair housing and equal opportunity. Home projects that request over $200,000 per unit must comply with Section 3 requirements of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 and work with HCR's FEHO to complete a Section 3 participation plan and subsequent reporting. Section 3 requires that economic opportunities generated by HUD funds be prioritized for low-income individuals and the businesses that hire or are owned by them, particularly in neighborhoods surrounding the project. So now I'll talk a little bit about the application process. We just had a round in 2024, so we learned a lot in that process and made some tweaks to our application workbook and related materials. Please make sure that you are using the latest guidance documents posted on our website. So, don't rely on materials you may have downloaded from last year. We'll point you to the guidance documents that are listed on our website, including the NOFA, the request for application, the term sheet, importantly, our underwriting guidelines. These are what we underwrite your application to. So if those pieces aren't there, then we'll be, requiring them and seeking them out from you if they're not in your application. Consult the administrative plan. All our activities have administrative plans that outline each funding and requirements and to comply with home rules and regulations. So consult those before you undertake an application. And finally, the project workbook that you'll be completing and submitting. And again, everything's found on our website. One thing to mention, we fully underwrite an application before an award is approved. So it's unlike some of our other programs that get awarded before underwriting is complete. So keep that in mind from the outset when managing expectations with the award process. In completing an application, carefully review and answer prompts and include information from the project and homebuyer underwriting guidelines. Like I mentioned, it'll save you time in the long run, save a lot of back and forth. If something in the underwriting guidelines may conflict with what you plan in your project, consult with our staff before submitting an application. We try to make it as simple as possible given the rules and home rules and regulations that we're bound to, but we understand it's a big undertaking. We want to make sure that before you undertake completing the application that your project would ultimately be in compliance. Make sure threshold items such as site control and firm funding commitments are in place. Home has to be the last funding in and cannot be committed until other funding commitments are in place. So keep that in mind as well. And then I mentioned choice limiting actions, but I'm going to mention it again. Note that the clock starts on choice limiting actions until environmental clearance is achieved. Consider if this works for your other funding sources and pending transactions. If you have options that expire or other funding sources that have timelines that might not agree with our environmental review process, then take that into consideration and perhaps consult with us to see if our funding would work. application submission constitutes the use of federal funds. So applications with pending purchases must not complete those purchases. So generally pause if you have something like a transaction that's in process. So I've said it a few times, but the home team is accessible, so please reach out to our home mailbox to schedule any technical assistance meeting prior to submitting your application. Okay, so I see that we do have some questions in the chat that we can start going through. And I think, and Stephanie, our director, is also on, and if she has any answers to provide, she'll also chime in, I'm sure. So I'll go through the first question and kind of move down the line. You mentioned that acquisition is an eligible expense. Does that include acquisition from the local government from their foreclosure list? The organization I work for generally acquires properties from the local foreclosure list. I would say this would be tricky because if you submit you would have to have that site control prior to applying. And that would not be an eligible expense if you had, acquired it prior to applying. So I'd say that no, that wouldn't include in that scenario. That wouldn't work.
Marge, I'm just gonna.
Yep.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna jump in here. So, well, the one thing I wanted to mention is that if it was acquired in conjunction with a project that you had in play or you had in mind, there are certain fees and costs that home cannot cover. So, for example, home cannot cover back taxes, let's say, which often are incurred with foreclosures. That being said, $250,000 per unit is not much money. So Marge had mentioned, the thought process is you'd have to come in with other funds. So technically you could acquire it again, like Marge had said in her earlier slides, that you can, as long as it's acquired in combination with this project, there are ways that you can come in with site control. So it wouldn't be, you'd have to have certain things in place if you're going to purchase a property so that you don't commit choice limiting actions. So it is possible, but you would probably need to talk to us first about planning that out. So it may not be a full-on purchase offer. It might just be a purchase option to show that you're going to go through eventually. And if you acquired it prior to the project, and you're holding it for too long in your portfolio, we can't go back and reimburse for something that's been sitting there. So does that kind of answer what you were looking for, Robert?
I think they're all on mute, so
okay.
I don't know if they can unmute, but Robert, if you have any follow-up, please reach out to our email. Got another question. Is there a minimum square footage to receive $250,000 for a 2-bedroom home? All of the design requirements are listed in the HCR homeownership design guidelines. So we don't have them necessarily a minimum, but it would have to comply with the design guidelines on our website to get the full subsidy amount and be reasonable given, everything that you're designing in your project. What are the ramifications if the home is not sold within 9 months of construction completion? Essentially, at that, we would want to see that you make many, plans and you have a good pipeline of home buyers to be able to sell your home within 9 months of construction completion. But if that doesn't happen, the rules and regulations say that it has to be turned into rental. But we really wouldn't. We were at the application stage, we're going to require a lot of assurances that that would not happen because the ultimate goal is homeownership and not rental.
Right, and even though the regulations allow it to convert to rental, that really isn't something that we are going to allow. So it would basically be recapture of funding. Because a rental project is completely different and we're not underwriting for that. And we don't know if the organization has the capacity for ownership and maintenance. So that really isn't within our scope that we're allowing.
Right. Okay, looks like a CHOTO might apply, but not a home PJ. Is that correct? If so, how would the CHOTO gain access to IDIS, and who determines the length of the affordability period? Little bit of a complicated question. So a CHOTO can apply within another home PJ. A home PJ itself cannot apply, but just trying to think. On those questions of IDIS, the CHOTO does not gain access to IDIS. We handle all IDIS input on behalf of the project. And Paul, if you'd like to discuss further, reach out and we can.
Yeah. So yeah, a home PJ can apply. So basically, you're saying if you get your own allocation of home funds, does that stop you from being eligible to apply? And the answer is no. We can provide home funds throughout the state. So if you're a CHOTO and you want to apply as a CHOTO, you could. But if you also get your own allocation of home funds, you could. We prefer to see that if you are a home PJ, that you use some of your allocation to come in and leverage our funds with, but it's not mandatory. Again, like Marge said, you don't have access to IDIS. We do through New York State. And Marge, did you answer the period of affordability question?
Who determines? No.
Yeah. So the period of affordability is determined by home regulations based on the dollar amount. So new construction is a 20-year period of affordability. Well, that might just be for rental, but usually it's going to be 15 because most people are doing rehab over $40,000 per unit. So that's a home regulatory requirement.
And then Chris was mentioning, I think that's about land banks buying foreclosed properties. Yeah, I think that Robert was asking probably in the case of land banks applying, which we've had at land banks apply with properties in their inventory. They just didn't include acquisition as part of their project cost. Can a project include combined activities, rehab and new construction, or like AHC? Do they need to be separate activities at the time of application? No, you can do a blend of new construction and rehab in your application. We have other groups that are doing that. Everything just has to be, your scope of work will be different and have to comply with the design guidelines for rehab and new construction. And I have another question. I'm on the website, but where exactly is the application located, or is there not an application but documents needed? If you go to our website near the bottom, under funding rounds, there's a homebuyer development heading with items underneath. The project workbook is the sort of main item you'll be filling out, and in it, it identifies all the attachments and documents needed to submit. The sale needs to be completed and title to the property transferred to the NP developer to submit the application. I think you're assuming that for acquisition, the acquisition would be from a local development corporation, what constitutes site control. So it can be, site control can be in the form of a purchase option. There's just some particular requirements that we need to make sure somewhere in the documentation that it lists that it's subject to, the ultimate purchase is subject to environmental review and clearance. Stephanie, do you have anything to add to that?
So no, you don't have to complete the sale in order to document site control. So like she said, there are other options. Um, the acquisition would be from a local development corporation. That's fine. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. It's the act of the choice limiting action means that you're doing something that limits your ability to make changes if the environmental review isn't approved or if there are problems with that. And the environmental regulations are a whole separate set of regulations that we have to comply with. And we've had some, difficulties in the past, so we just want to make sure that we're upfront and see everything up front. If you do happen to complete the property transfer prior to application, then that's fine. That's what we see most of the time is the property is purchased, is sitting in the portfolio, and then groups come in for the rehab funds after the fact. Because 250 usually isn't enough to cover both. But if you want to incorporate the purchase, then I suggest maybe you send an email with your particulars as to where you are in the process, and then we can talk to you one-on-one about it.
Yep. Will an access agreement with the municipality constitute site control? I'm not familiar with what the details of an access agreement would look like, but again, if you have something in mind and you want us to vet it before you apply, please email us and we can help you through that. So Robert, when asked the earlier question, he had a follow-up. He said, we are looking at this funding for future projects, so this would be acquiring properties we don't currently have, trying to figure out a private acquisition versus from the local government is more feasible with this funding. So noted, we could look at what you have in mind if you would like to email us further. You mentioned an eligible homeowner must comply with underwriting standards of 33 front end and 45 back end. Can you review that again? Stephanie, would you like to go over? Stephanie has a background in underwriting home buyers, so if it's all right.
I guess I'm not sure exactly what the question is. So this is something that if you don't know what it is, you need to engage the assistance of a homeownership or housing counseling professional. And I think Marge went over this in her presentation. Home regulations require that the buyer be counseled by a HUD certified homeownership counselor. So basically, the ratio 33-43, I'm not sure if you need an explanation of what front end means versus back end, but I guess I'll just say front end means just the portion of their gross income that goes toward the mortgage payment. And then the back end is the mortgage payment and all other debts. In summary, that's what it is. So, if you need something more specific on that, we can work with you directly.
Yep. What if we have properties in inventory that we acquired, completed environmental review, pre-development demolition, and now we are sitting on a development site? Can we use those funds for the development side of the project? So in this case, yes, we would have our own environmental review that we, engage in, the NEPA review and SEQA review, but that is fine if that pre-development work and demolition and you have a clean site, that's something that can be put into our project, into a homebuyer development project for sure. Can this be coupled with other state programs such as AHOP or Block by Block? As far as AHOP goes, we limit the number of units for this funding source as 4 or less, and AHOP is 5 or more. So it wouldn't be coupled with AHOP. Block by Block, I'm not as familiar with, but if you want to, you know, submit a question to our email, we can kind of talk you through if that funding source would work well with ours. So this would be where someone asked, this would be in conjunction with LBI funds that were used for the demo part of the project. So we have other, in our last round, we had LBI used as part of funding as part of the Homebuyer development project. So it's possible to use those funds as well. For manufactured, modular, and especially 3D built homes, other programs have required MFG housing to meet HUD codes. Is that the case here as well? We would have to meet, you know, HUD rules and regulations as well as the homeownership design guidelines. So you would have to look through and see, you know, what you're proposing and if that would work with our guidelines. How many awards are anticipated being made by this round? You know, I guess it depends on the number of applications we receive and the amounts that are requested. We've had, you know, we've had applications for the full amount of $1 million per project, but we've had for 4 units, but we've also had groups apply for 1 unit. It really depends on what your organization has the capacity to complete, as well as what your community has a demand for. So I can't answer that specifically, but you know, if you can kind of make some conclusions based on that. Okay, that's all the questions we have. If there's no more, we will, you know, close out. And like I mentioned, oh, one more from Joe McGrath. We'll wait. But the presentation will be posted to our website, as well as the recording of the presentation. So all of that will be accessible following this. Okay. Will there be future rounds beyond this round? And if so, when would you expect that? So, you know, we have 10 million set aside for this. We anticipate there being future rounds. We'll make that determination closer to the end of this round, and likely it'll be on an annual basis that we'll open up funding rounds. You're welcome. Okay. And like we said, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email us, and we'd be happy to walk you through your project. Thank you, everyone.